There is a moment in every transformation when the soul hesitates. It has already crossed the threshold. The old self is gone. A new consciousness has already taken root within you. And yet, you find yourself turning back. You find yourself wanting to explain, to prove, to persuade the old world to see what you have become. As if your evolution is not real until it is witnessed. As if your liberation is not valid until it is approved by the very people, the very patterns you have outgrown. This is the psychological temptation that arrests more awakenings than any doubt or fear. The compulsion to perform your healing for an audience that only knows your wound. To make your inner revolution a matter of public record. But listen closely. I want you to feel, not merely understand, the truth that is rising beneath the surface of your life. Every transformation begins in silence, long before the world is invited to witness it. And yet, so many of you exhaust your spirit by trying to drag the external world into a conversation that belongs entirely to the inner one. You want others to acknowledge your growth, your healing, your awakening, as if the validity of your transformation depends on their recognition. But the psyche does not evolve through applause. It evolves through necessity. Through the pressure of the unconscious, demanding that you confront what you once buried. What makes your comeback unstoppable is not your ability to persuade others that you are different. It is your willingness to stop performing your evolution, and allow it to become your quiet, undeniable reality. There is a strange suffering that arises when a person has grown beyond their old patterns, yet remains surrounded by those who only know the older version of themselves. This suffering does not come from the growth itself, but from the need to be seen as having grown. It is the ego's last attempt to keep you chained to the past. It wants acknowledgement, validation, a mirror held up by others to confirm that the inner work was not in vain. But understand this, the unconscious does not liberate you so that you may re-enter the world and win approval. It liberates you so that you may walk freely, without asking for permission to exist beyond who you once were. Many of you stand at this fragile threshold, where the new self has already been born internally, yet the outer world still interacts with the ghost of your past self. And in that tension, a deep temptation arises, to explain yourself, to justify your healing, to prove your change. But the more one tries to prove transformation, the more one remains tethered to the identity that required transformation in the first place. You cannot walk into the future while still negotiating with the shadows of your past audience. You cannot rise to your destiny while still offering footnotes to people who never bother to read your story. Let me offer you an image. Imagine a chrysalis beginning to crack open. The butterfly does not pause to defend why it no longer resembles the creature it once was. It does not return to the ground to tell the old world, "Look, I have wings now, look, I am different." Its only responsibility is to fly. If it attempted to justify its metamorphosis, it would never leave the earth at all. Humans, however, often linger at the edge of emergence. Hesitant. Fearful that others will not accept the truth of their transformation. But you must understand, your emergence is not for them. It was never for them. It is the fulfillment of a psychic necessity far older than their opinion. There is a dream I once encountered in the analysis of a woman who struggled with precisely this conflict. In her dream, she was walking across a bridge made of glass. Beneath her feet was the vast ocean of her unconscious, shimmering with 1,000 symbolic reflections. On the far side of the bridge stood her future, indistinct yet unmistakably luminous. But behind her were the figures of her past, calling out, demanding explanations, demanding she defend why she was crossing at all. In the dream, she turned towards them, attempting to shout back that she had changed, that she was no longer the person they believed her to be. And with every shout, the glass beneath her feet trembled. It was only when she faced forward again, silent, refusing to justify her journey, that the bridge stabilized, and carried her safely to the other side. The psyche speaks in these images because it knows that you understand symbols more deeply than you understand language. You recognize, even without explanation, that turning back weakens your path, and facing forward strengthens it. When you stop trying to prove yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you reclaim the psychic energy that was being drained through the need for approval. And once that energy returns to its rightful center, your comeback becomes inevitable. Let us go deeper. The part of you that wants to prove you've changed is not evil. It is simply frightened. It is the inner child who learned that worth must be demonstrated, that love must be earned, that identity must be argued. This child lives within many adults, shaping their relationships, their choices, their reactions. When she feels unseen, she pleads for recognition. When he feels doubted, he performs the very self he is trying to transcend. Transformation, then, is not complete until the inner child is reassured, soothed, and invited to retire from the role of spokesperson for your life. Only the adult self, the individuating self, can walk forward without explanation. In my studies of the unconscious, I found again and again that the need to prove one's transformation is itself a remnant of an unhealed archetype. The father archetype in particular casts a long shadow here. If you were raised needing to justify your choices, defend your emotions, or earn acknowledgement through performance, then later in life, you may find yourself trying to prove your healing to figures who symbolically resemble that father energy, partners, friends, employers, even strangers. But this is an illusion. You are not trying to convince them. You are trying to appease the internalized father who still sits at the throne of judgment within you. Once you dethrone this internal figure, once you no longer seek validation from the archaic authority, you become free in a way the world can feel but cannot quite explain. Your comeback becomes unstoppable when it is no longer fueled by reaction, but by revelation. As long as your growth is a response to someone else's doubt, you are still orbiting their gravitational field. But when your growth is an expression of your inner necessity, of your individuation, then no external force can interrupt it. You walk differently. You speak differently. You choose differently. And people feel the difference even if they do not understand it. Consider also the paradox of human relationships. The more you try to prove you've changed, the less others believe it. They sense the anxious energy behind the performance. They sense that you are still negotiating your identity. But when you stop explaining, when your transformation becomes quiet, embodied, and calm, others begin to feel something unmistakable. Your inner authority has returned. Your center of gravity has shifted from the external world back to the self. This is the point where many become afraid. Because this kind of calm is powerful. It dismantles old dynamics, dissolves dysfunctional patterns, and forces others to meet you at a higher level, or fall away naturally. The person who stops explaining themselves becomes unpredictable to those who depended on their compliance. Your silence becomes unsettling to those who once relied on your need for validation. And so your comeback, the true comeback, does not roar. It emanates. There is another dream. This one from a man who struggled to release the need to prove he was no longer defined by his failures. In the dream, he stood at a doorway carved into a mountainside. Behind him was a loud, chaotic crowd shouting accusations, but in front of him was a silent forest glowing with golden mist. He wanted to step into the forest, but he hesitated, turning back to defend himself, to refute the accusations, to insist on his new identity. With every defense, the doorway narrowed. The forest grew dimmer. Finally, exhausted, he turned away from the crowd, said nothing, and stepped forward. As he did, the doorway widened again, and the forest light surged around him. This is the symbolic truth. Justification narrows your path. Silence widens it. When you relinquish the need to prove your transformation, you reclaim your psychic freedom. You discover that you no longer need to persuade, convince, or negotiate with the past. You simply walk. And in the walking you become. This is how the self emerges. Quietly. Inevitably. Without permission. And now, as you sit here listening, a quiet recognition may be stirring inside you. You know exactly which part of your life is asking you to stop explaining. You know exactly where you have outgrown a role, a relationship, a narrative. You know exactly where your inner wisdom has already advanced, while your outer life trails behind in hesitation. Do not shame yourself for this lag. The outer life always moves more slowly than the inner one, but it will catch up if you stop turning around. Your comeback is not a performance. It is a homecoming to your own self. And the moment you stop trying to prove you've changed, your transformation stops being a story and becomes a force. There is a moment in every human life when the psyche whispers a truth that can no longer be ignored. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It does not announce itself with thunder or command your obedience with force. Instead, it drifts upward from the deep unconscious like a small spark rising from the ashes of something you have finally outgrown. And the truth is this: the person you are trying to prove yourself to is no longer your judge, no longer your reference point, no longer the axis upon which your inner world should rotate. When this truth arrives, the ego panics, for it has built its identity around that external mirror. But the self, your true center, recognizes this moment as liberation. To stop proving you've changed is not an act of defiance. It is an act of integration. It means the transformation has descended from the surface of your consciousness into the deeper layers of your being. As long as change remains on the surface, intellectual, conceptual, performative, it will always require witnesses. But when change reaches the archetypal level, it becomes silent, instinctive, embodied. You are no longer trying to be different. You simply are. And this kind of being cannot be explained to anyone. It can only be lived. Many of you have lived inside roles that were never yours to begin with. You became the caretaker, the healer, the rescuer, the dutiful child, the compliant partner, the person who apologized first, the one who softened your truth so others would not withdraw love. These roles were not chosen. They were assigned by your early environment, shaped by the emotional climates of your parents, carved into your psyche by the invisible expectations of your family system. And for many years you performed them well because performing them ensured survival. But now something within you resists. Something old has cracked. Something ancient has stirred. The unconscious does not tolerate roles that suffocate the self for too long. It begins to create tension, discomfort, restlessness. Dreams become vivid. Relationships feel tight, as though the soul has outgrown the skeleton that once held it together. And the person begins reaching for a new identity, a more authentic one. Yet the old world continues to speak to them as if they have not changed at all. This is where the conflict arises. You want the world to see you as you feel yourself becoming. You want the family who once misunderstood you to acknowledge your evolution. You want the person who doubted your worth to finally recognize what you have always carried. You want the partner who broke your sense of self to see that you have rebuilt what they once shattered. And you want the past to bow before the new self you fought so hard to create. But the unconscious does not work this way. It reveals a different truth. External validation belongs to the ego. And the ego's hunger is never satisfied. The more you try to prove you've changed, the more you reinforce the belief that others hold authority over your identity. The need to be seen is not the need of the healed self. It is the cry of the wound itself, asking not to be abandoned again. Let me tell you about a dream from an analysant who struggled with this dynamic. In her dream, she was carrying a small lantern through a dark forest. Every time she encountered a figure from her past, she would lift the lantern, trying to shine its light upon herself, to show them who she had become. But each time she did, the lantern dimmed, as if its flame could not survive the wind of their expectations. Only when she lowered the lantern and allowed the light to fall naturally, unforced, unclutched, did the flame grow bright again. Eventually, the forest illuminated itself. She realized that the lantern was never meant to be held up as a performance, but carried like an inner truth. Her psyche was telling her, you do not illuminate yourself by lifting your transformation up to others. Your light grows when you carry it quietly and walk. You may not realize it yet, but your comeback has already begun. It started the moment you became too tired to explain yourself. The moment you stopped correcting people's misconceptions. The moment you accepted that some will never understand you because understanding you would require them to confront parts of themselves they have spent their entire lives avoiding. When you reached this point, something shifted. Your energy no longer leaked outward. It returned to its source. And when your energy returns to you, your destiny begins to take shape. The archetype of rebirth, what I often refer to as the process of individuation, does not require an audience. In fact, the presence of an audience can interfere with transformation because your focus becomes divided. One part of you is evolving. Another part is watching yourself evolve. This observation fractures your psyche. It creates an ego consciousness around the transformation that weakens it. True growth requires descent into the unconscious, where the ego is not the protagonist but the witness. When you stop trying to prove you've changed, the ego steps aside. It no longer interrupts the process. The unconscious can then reorganize your inner world without resistance. The self emerges not as an idea, but as an embodied presence. Calm, centered, unequivocal. And people feel this presence even if they cannot articulate why. Some will respond to your quiet transformation with awe. Others with confusion. Some with admiration. Others with fear. Because when you change without explaining, you disrupt the psychic contracts that once governed your relationships. The person who relied on your self-doubt will feel destabilized. The person who took advantage of your guilt will sense their influence fading. The person who expected you to remain small will feel confronted by your expansion. And the dynamics that once defined your connections will dissolve naturally. This is not punishment. It is alignment. You are not responsible for soothing the discomfort that your healing creates in others. Their reactions belong to their unconscious, not yours. When you stop trying to prove your change, they must face their own shadows, their own projections, their own unexamined wounds. Many will resist this. Some will retreat. A few will rise. But none of this concerns your path. There is a deeper symbol at work here. In alchemy, transformation is never validated by external observers. It is validated by the substance itself becoming something new. Gold that no longer resembles lead. Spirit that no longer resembles matter. Consciousness that no longer resembles instinct. No alchemist shouts, "Look, I have changed it." He waits in silence until the transformation is complete. And then the world sees the result without needing explanation. Your psyche works the same way. The golden self emerges only when the performance of change ends. Let us deepen this further. The unconscious contains what I call the shadow, the parts of you that were denied, repressed, or exiled because the environment could not hold them. Many people remain stuck in cycles of trying to prove themselves because they have not yet integrated their shadow. They want the world to see their light, but they have not made peace with their darkness. They want others to acknowledge their growth, yet they have not acknowledged their inner fractures. Integration means this: you no longer hide your flaws, nor do you flaunt your strengths. You become whole. And a whole person is not concerned with being believed. Their very existence is their evidence. You can feel it when someone has integrated their shadow. There is a quiet gravity to them. They do not defend themselves. They do not chase validation. Their no becomes firm. Their yes becomes intentional. Their presence becomes unmistakably grounded. This is what makes their comeback unstoppable. Not force. Not explanation. But authenticity. When a person reaches this state, the psyche becomes aligned. The inner child, the adult self, the shadow, the persona, the anima or animus, all begin to harmonize. Energy that was once scattered becomes concentrated. And this concentration creates momentum. Your life begins to reorganize itself around your new identity. Opportunities appear that match your inner truth. People who resonate with your evolved self enter your life naturally, as if drawn by an invisible magnet. And those who belong to your past fall away without conflict. This is the mystery of individuation. When you stop performing change, you begin embodying it. When you embody it, you become undeniable. When you become undeniable, your comeback becomes destiny. In this quiet unfolding, you no longer rush. You no longer plead. You no longer justify. You allow your path to strengthen beneath your feet, instead of behind your words. And the deeper you move into this alignment, the more you realize that proving yourself was never a step on the path. It was the cage that trapped you beside it. Your psyche wants freedom, not approval. It wants expansion, not explanation. It wants integration, not performance. And when you finally stop trying to prove you've changed, the psyche breathes again, like a chamber within you that has been sealed for decades suddenly opening and flooding with air. Feel this for a moment. Feel how your body relaxes when you imagine no longer explaining yourself to anyone. Feel how your shoulders loosen when you imagine releasing the need to be understood. Feel how your breath deepens when you imagine simply living your truth, without raising it up like a banner. This stillness is not emptiness. It is power. And this power is the foundation of your comeback. There is an ancient truth within the psyche that many overlook. Transformation is not linear and it is not performative. It is cyclical and symbolic. You do not ascend once and forever. You spiral, returning to old layers with new consciousness each time. And yet, those who witness your journey from the outside often see only the surface. They see your returns as regressions, your silence as avoidance, your introspection as distance. They misinterpret the movements of your soul because they do not understand the symbolic rhythm through which the unconscious reshapes a life. And this is why trying to prove you've changed is a betrayal of your own depth. The moment you attempt to justify your evolution, you reduce something profound, something sacred, into something consumable. You take the language of the soul and translate it into the language of social approval. And the translation is always insufficient. No explanation can capture the dream that woke you. No sentence can express the archetype that rose within you. No conversation can communicate the moment you realized you could no longer betray yourself to maintain belonging. Human beings suffer most not from their wounds, but from their explanations of their wounds. They believe they need to be understood in order to heal. But understanding is not the catalyst of healing. Acceptance is. And acceptance begins when you stop trying to persuade others that your inner world is real. Of course it is real. It speaks through your instincts, your fears, your longings, your dreams. It speaks through the tremor in your voice when you tell the truth for the first time. It speaks through the quiet satisfaction you feel when you stop abandoning your own boundaries. Transformation does not ask for permission. It unfolds because the unconscious demands it. It is the same force that cracks the seed open beneath the soil, that pushes the sprout toward the sun, that compels the butterfly to leave the chrysalis. These transformations do not occur because the world is watching. They occur because nature insists upon evolution. Your psyche operates under the same law. When the unconscious is ready to move, it will disrupt anything that resists its movement. This is why your relationships may have felt strained during your awakening. Why your old life seemed too small. Why certain conversations drained you in ways they never had before. Why your silence began to feel like a sanctuary instead of a threat. Why you started noticing patterns that once blended into the background. You are not imagining it. You are awakening. And the more you awaken, the less tolerance you have for performing the version of yourself that kept others comfortable. Every time you try to prove your change, you step back into an identity that your soul has already shed. That is why it feels so heavy, so draining. You are trying to speak through a mask that no longer fits your face. There is a pattern I have seen repeated across countless lives. The moment a person stops trying to prove their growth is the moment their growth becomes irreversible. Until then, transformation remains fragile, susceptible to old roles, old expectations, old fears. But once the internal shift reaches the point where explanation becomes unnecessary, the transformation becomes anchored. A new center of gravity forms within the psyche, and the world can no longer pull you backward. This inner anchoring often arrives through dreams. The unconscious uses symbols to tell you that a new phase has begun. Some dream of mirrors shattering, symbolizing the collapse of the old persona. Some dream of walking through doorways, symbolizing transition. Others dream of strangers guiding them across rivers or mountains, symbols of initiation. Each dream carries the same message. You no longer belong to the old world and you no longer need its approval of the new one. Let me share another symbolic image from analysis. A man dreamt he was walking through an ancient library. The books were dusty, worn, untouched. Each one representing stories people had assigned to him. Stories of failure, stories of inadequacy, stories of who he was supposed to be. He climbed a ladder to a high shelf and found a book bound in black leather with no title. When he opened it, the pages were blank. As he touched the empty pages, the ink began to rise from the paper, forming new words. The story he had never allowed himself to live. The library shook violently. The old books fell from their shelves, disintegrating into dust. But the blank book remained in his hands, growing heavier, more substantial, as though his new identity was solidifying. The message was clear. The story you are writing now has no room for proving the chapters you once survived. Only those who refuse to let go of the old books require proof of your transformation. Only those who benefit from your old limitations demand that you justify your growth. Only those who fear their own unconscious change will try to pull you back into old versions of yourself. Your task is not to argue with them. Your task is to continue writing the book that rises from your hands. In the process of individuation, you become less concerned with how others perceive your transformation, because you are more attuned to the inner sensation of alignment. You know you have changed not because the world approves, but because your inner world feels coherent for the first time. Your choices match your truth. Your boundaries match your worth. Your silence is no longer fear, but discernment. And your relationships reflect a new equilibrium, where you no longer play the role of the wounded child seeking acceptance. The greatest shift happens when you no longer need your past to validate your future. This is the turning point. This is where the comeback begins. Your comeback is not a victory march. It is not a performance of strength. It is not loud or dramatic or theatrical. It is the quiet reclaiming of your soul after years of exile. It is the decision to live according to your inner authority instead of external permission. It is the courage to walk forward even when no one applauds. It is the recognition that the only approval worth seeking is the approval of the self. And once the self becomes your compass, the world itself begins to rearrange around your path. Old relationships fall away because they belong to the person you no longer are. Old habits dissolve because they contradict your new identity. Old fears weaken because they no longer hold symbolic meaning. Old roles crumble because the archetype within you has shifted. When the archetype shifts, the entire psychic structure must shift as well. Imagine a constellation in the night sky. If one star moves into a new position, the image it once formed will vanish, and a new constellation must emerge. This is what happens when a person undergoes profound inner transformation. You are no longer the child trying to be good. You are no longer the wounded one seeking repair. You are no longer the caretaker earning love. The star that anchored these patterns has moved. A new constellation is forming. And the people who look at you and try to force you back into the old constellation are simply looking at the wrong sky. Your job is not to correct their vision. Your job is to rise to the one shining above you. Now, there is a sacred loneliness in this part of the journey. Not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness of emergence. You are stepping away from the collective expectations that once shaped your identity. You are hearing the call of the self. And the self always speaks in solitude. But do not mistake solitude for isolation. Solitude is the psychic space where the soul grows its roots. It is where the new self metabolizes, strengthens, and becomes whole. And once it becomes whole, something extraordinary happens. Your presence becomes a mirror. People can no longer project their misconceptions onto you without seeing their own reflection. They cannot diminish you without facing their own insecurity. They cannot manipulate you without confronting their own lack of integrity. Your very existence becomes a catalyst for their unconscious work. This is why your comeback becomes unstoppable. Not because you force it, but because your transformation forces them to choose. Rise with this truth. When you stop trying to prove you've changed, you stop negotiating with the past. You stop bargaining with old ghosts. You stop explaining your soul's direction. And your future becomes inevitable. The path that once trembled beneath you now strengthens. The door that once narrowed now widens. The forest that once dimmed now glows. Because your energy is no longer leaking backward. It is flowing forward. Entirely. Fully. Unquestionably. There comes a moment in every awakening when the soul, almost without warning, turns its face fully toward the future. It does not consult the past. It does not negotiate with memory. It does not ask the ego's permission. It simply chooses the new direction with a clarity that feels ancient, as though destiny itself has pulled a chair closer and whispered, "It is time." This moment arrives quietly. Yet it carries the force of an earthquake. And those who reach it know, sometimes with a trembling recognition, that they have crossed a threshold from which there is no turning back. You may not realize it, but you are standing at such a threshold now. The fact that you are drawn to this teaching, the fact that you are listening with such intensity, the fact that you feel an indescribable shift inside your chest, these are not coincidences. They are signals that the unconscious is already in motion. You are not here to learn how to change. You are here because you have changed, and your psyche is asking you to stop explaining it, to stop proving it, to stop offering your transformation as evidence to people still trapped in their own illusions. The truth is simple. The old world cannot validate the self you have become, because the old world required your smaller self to exist. If it acknowledged your transformation, it would have to transform itself. And so it resists. It clings to the outdated image of you, the one that made sense within its limited framework. It speaks to you as though you remain that former version. It interacts with your past, not your present. And the more you try to defend your new self to it, the more entangled you become in its gravity. But the unconscious knows better. The unconscious has already rewritten the map. It has already shifted the archetype within you. And once the archetype changes, nothing external can hold you in the old pattern. The mother's expectations lose their power. The father's criticism loses its weight. The family's projections slip through your fingers like sand. The partner who once defined your identity begins to feel like a character from a story you no longer inhabit. Even your fears change shape, becoming shadows cast by a person you are no longer trying to be. This inner shift is irreversible. It is the psychological equivalent of dawn. No matter how long the night was, no matter how deeply you believed you were bound to it, once the first light enters the psyche, darkness cannot reclaim its territory. Yet people often try to drag you back into the night. Not because they are malicious, but because your awakening disrupts the equilibrium they once relied upon. They feel the change in you long before they can name it. And the unconscious part of them that fears its own growth reacts with resistance. This is why silence becomes your greatest ally. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of inner sovereignty. When you stop explaining, you stop participating in their denial. When you stop defending your healing, you stop fueling the dynamic that kept you small. When you stop offering proof, you reclaim the energy they once consumed. And that reclaimed energy becomes momentum. Momentum towards the self you are becoming. Momentum toward the destiny unfolding before you. There is a phenomenon I observe time and time again. When a person truly steps into their new identity without performing it, the world around them reorganizes. People begin responding differently without quite understanding why. Some soften. Some retreat. Some try harder to hold on. Some disappear altogether. But all of them reveal their true relationship not to you, but to their own unconscious. Your transformation is a mirror. And not everyone is ready to see what is reflected there. Do not interfere with this process. Let the mirror do its work. Consider a symbolic image. A person standing at the edge of a vast lake at dawn. The surface is still, reflecting the sky. But as the sun rises, the reflection shifts. The colors deepen. The air changes. The lake does not explain itself. It does not justify the transformation of its surface. It simply receives the light and mirrors what it receives. You are the lake. Your transformation is the sunrise. Those who cannot accept the reflection are simply facing a light they are not ready to see. Every time you speak your transformation into the world, hoping for validation, you lower the sun a little, dimming yourself to keep others comfortable. But when you remain silent, calm, grounded, rooted in your new identity, the sun continues to rise. And the reflection becomes undeniable. The world must either adjust to the new light or close its eyes. This is why your comeback becomes unstoppable. Not because you overpower anyone, but because you stop dimming yourself to match the darkness around you. You begin to embody the law of psychological nature. That which rises naturally cannot be pushed back down without great violence to the soul. And your soul will not tolerate such violence anymore. Let us look again at the inner child, for they hold a key to this process. The child within you once believed that love depended on performance. That safety depended on compliance. That belonging depended on shrinking, softening, appeasing, justifying. And so the child became a master of explanation. They learned to offer reasons for their needs, defenses for their emotions, narratives for their worth. But now, as the adult self awakens, the individuating self, the inner child must be relieved of this task. It is not their job to defend who you have become. It is not their job to convince anyone that your heart has healed. It is not their job to justify the life you are choosing. Your task now is to take the child gently by the hand and say, "It is safe to rest. You do not need to explain anymore. I will protect the truth of who we are." When this integration occurs, when the inner child no longer animates the adult self, you will feel a profound shift in your presence. A steadiness. A luminosity that does not flicker. A certainty that requires no audience. People will sense it in your eyes, in your voice, in the way you stand. You will feel it in your spine, like a subtle current aligning your entire being. The psychological truth is this: a person who no longer needs to prove they've changed becomes an archetype of their own. And archetypes do not explain themselves. They simply radiate. This radiance is what changes your relationships, your opportunities, your path. It sends a silent signal into the world that says, "I am no longer available for anything that does not honor the person I have become." And the world responds. It cannot help but respond. For the human psyche recognizes authenticity the way the body recognizes warmth. It moves toward it naturally. Now let me speak of destiny. For you are closer to yours than you think. Destiny is not a predetermined path, but the convergence of your inner truth with your outer life. When these two realities begin to align, the psyche experiences a sensation of inevitability, as though unseen forces are guiding your steps, arranging circumstances, shaping synchronicities. You may have already noticed this. A conversation that arrives at the perfect moment. A sudden clarity that dissolves a long-standing confusion. A door closing only for another to open in its place. A dream that reveals a truth you were afraid to name. A shift in your energy that others feel before you speak a word. These are not coincidences. They are signals that you have stopped performing a self that does not belong to you. You have stopped explaining a transformation that cannot be explained. You have surrendered the need for external verification. And in doing so, you have aligned with the self, the inner nucleus of your being that moves according to laws older than language, older than memory, older even than the personal unconscious. When the self becomes your center, your comeback is not something you chase. It is something you embody. Something you attract. Something you become. And so I tell you this truth with a quiet certainty of someone who has watched thousands of souls return to themselves. Your comeback became unstoppable the moment you stopped trying to prove you had changed. Because that was the moment your energy stopped leaking backward. The moment your past lost its authority. The moment your inner child was freed from performance. The moment your shadow began to integrate. The moment your archetype shifted. The moment your destiny inhaled its first breath. Walk forward now. Not with explanation. Not with performance. But with presence. Your transformation is already complete. The world will catch up in time.